And because the defendant was a designated driver that drove drunk, Vanessa Sullivan is dead. Members of the jury, Vanessa Sullivan just turned 21. She had plans to go to law school, probably do something similar to what I'm doing right now. She had a mother and a father that loved her and supported her. She had a best friend and many more that looked up to her. She had a promising future. And on September 25th, 2010, she made the mistake of going to Chuggy's bar with the defendant. Now, she planned to have a good time, just like any 21-year-old would. She planned to watch a local band, have a good time with her best friend and another from college, drink a little bit, and return home safely. But we all know that didn't happen. Members of the jury, when they left that bar, as they were leaving, Miss Sullivan and her best friend, they told the defendant, maybe we should get a cab. I think you've had too much to drink. I don't think it'll be safe to get on the road like this. The defendant refused, grabbed those keys, and got behind the wheel of that car. As they were driving down Canyon Road, Miss Sullivan and her best friend begged the defendant to slow down. Maybe you're going too fast. It's raining really hard. There's a bad storm. This isn't safe. The defendant said, I'm fine. Be quiet. The defendant took it too far. She lost control of that car. Not because there was a deer. No one saw a deer that night. In fact, Miss Sullivan's last words to the defendant were, Danny, what are you doing? Stay on the road. Not Danny, look out for a deer. Or Danny, look out for that branch in the middle of the road. Just stay on the road. Get me home safe. That's why we're here today, members of the jury. Because we are charging the defendant with first-degree murder and driving under the influence of alcohol. That's the prosecution. We had a burden of proof today. We had to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Danny Dawson, the defendant, is driving under the influence of alcohol. So we brought you Dr. Avery Smith. Dr. Smith told you that the defendant blew a breath alcohol content or a blood alcohol concentration of 0.19, over twice the legal limit. Not only that, but the defense's own hired gun, Dr. Ashley Norton, told you that Danny Dawson was too drunk to drive that night. Not only too drunk, but the minimum amount of blood alcohol content that the defendant could have had was 0.08. And we know what the maximum was, 0.19. Members of the jury, we have to prove that Danny Dawson was driving under the influence of alcohol beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond reasonable doubt means that we've got to prove all of our elements beyond doubts that you've got common sense reason for it. We also have to prove that the defendant was guilty of murder. Now, in order to do this, we had to prove that the defendant recklessly engaged in conduct that created grave risk of death. Let's go through that night when the defendant was tossing back drink after drink after drink that night, knowing that it was even a possibility that she would get behind the wheel. That was reckless. When the defendant grabbed Vanessa Sullivan's keys and got behind the wheel of that car, knowing she had had over 11 drinks that night, that was reckless. When the defendant sped down Canyon Road in the pouring rain with no street lights after she'd had over 11 drinks, that was reckless. When the defendant chose to keep speeding after her passengers begged and pleaded for her to slow down, Now, we also had proof that the defendant had an extreme indifference to human life. Members of the jury, when the defendant got behind the wheel of that car after she had had over 11 drinks that night, she didn't just take her own safety into account. She took into her hands the lives of Vanessa Sullivan and her best friend. Not only those two passengers, but the lives of anyone she passed on the road that night. Members of the jury, someone who gets behind the wheel knowing they're tipsy doesn't care who they pass or who they hit or who they could kill. The defendant sure did. Members of the jury, this is why we have Mothers Against Drunk Driving. This is why we have people coming to our children's schools to educate them on the dangers of driving after drinking. So young girls like Vanessa Sullivan don't die. The defendant was a designated driver. The defendant was a designated driver that drove drunk on September 25th, 2010 on Canyon Road. And because the defendant was a designated driver that drove drunk, Vanessa Sullivan is dead. Find her guilty.
Is there closing for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May I set up the courtroom?
You may.
May I proceed? May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury, today's case was riddled with missing pieces. On September 25th, 2010, Vanessa Sullivan lost her life in a car accident. This is a tragedy, and it is a fact. That night, Danny Dawson drove the vehicle that was in that accident. That is a fact. And that night, Danny drank alcohol. That, too, is a fact. But members of the jury, these facts do not mean that Danny is a murderer. Today, the prosecution would have you believe that these are the only facts in today's case, that these are the only pieces to the puzzle. Today, we've shown you that it's simply not true. There are pieces missing. Pieces like the weather conditions that night. You heard today how heavily it was raining, how it was storming, how it was pouring rain. Visibility was incredibly difficult. Danny didn't swerve off the road because she was grossly intoxicated. She swerved because she could barely see in front of her. Pieces are missing like the deer that was on the road that night. Danny Dawson didn't swerve because she was being reckless. She swerved to miss colliding with an animal. And there are pieces missing like the dangers of Canyon Road. Today you heard that that road was an accident just waiting to happen. Today you heard that that road wasn't safe. That there are accidents that have occurred on that road, and this accident was waiting to happen. And today we've brought before you witnesses to show these missing pieces that are in the prosecution's case. You heard from Ashley Norton, an intoxilizer specialist, who told you about the missing pieces in the prosecution's assertion that Danny Dawson had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.19. He told you how unrealistically high that number really is. How Danny's actual BAC was less than half that. He told you about the missing pieces in that test, about the factors that could have changed that BAC. Danny Dawson had acid reflux, heartburn, had burped or belched, those results would be different. Today you learned that Danny wasn't observed for the full 15 minutes before having that test conducted. Those pieces were missing in the prosecution's case. We also heard the testimony of Leslie Roman, who reconstructed the accident that occurred on September 25th. She told you that this accident is consistent with a deer running in front of the road and Danny having to swerve to avoid hitting that deer. She told you just how dangerous this road is. She told us that the speed on this road is just too fast. That there aren't any warning signs telling people that they need to slow down before navigating the curve. She told us that the run doesn't extend far enough. That if it had extended far enough, this accident wouldn't have occurred. Vanessa Sullivan would still be alive today. She told you how there weren't sufficient street lights on that street. She told you that trees were allowed to grow dangerously close to the road. She told you that this was an accident just waiting to happen. And you heard the testimony of Danny Dawson. She told you that she was at Chubby's bar that night, celebrating her friend's birthday. She told you that she knew her limits, and she didn't consume alcohol to a gross extent. She knew when she would be fine to drive. She got behind the wheel that night, knowing that she could do it. But members of the jury, what she didn't know, what she couldn't foresee, what pieces are missing in the prosecution's case today, is how badly it was raining, how there was a deer in the road, and how dangerous that road was to begin with. You even heard from the prosecution's witness, London Bennett, a resident of Canyon Road, about how dangerous that road is. He told you how he's seen cars flying down that road. Nothing was ever done to make that speed limit not so high. He told you about the near accidents, the minor accidents, and the major accident that has previously occurred on that road. Members of the jury, this is not the only fatal accident to occur on this road. This is an accident just waiting to happen. Now today, the prosecution has the burden of proof. They must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Danny Dawson is a murderer. And to do this, they had to prove to you three things. They had to prove to you that she was extremely reckless, that she had a disregard for Vanessa Sullivan's life, and that ended up killing Vanessa Sullivan. And members of the jury, they were unable to meet this burden today. We showed you reasons to doubt with every missing piece that we pointed out in their case. Members of the jury, they said that Danny Dawson was a designated driver who drove drunk. But intoxication does not prove extreme recklessness. Having a few drinks with friends before driving home doesn't prove a disregard for human life. They've been unable to prove that Danny Dawson is a murderer. Today, you heard that Danny knew her limits, and she didn't push those limits. She couldn't have known that the road would be this dangerous. Those pieces were just missing from the prosecution's case. Now, we as the defense give our deepest sympathies to the Sullivan family. None of us know what they're going through right now. This accident was a tragedy. Members of the jury, this accident was preventable. If that road had had the safety precautions in place, this wouldn't have happened. Now, it's easy to look at the facts in today's case. It's easy to see someone that had been consuming alcohol, that got in a vehicle, And when someone in the vehicle died, it's easy to point the finger of blame. It's easy to make that connection, but it isn't just. And in our legal system, we require that everyone gets equal treatment. That includes Damie Dawson. Don't ruin the life of someone. Don't ruin her future based on a case that has missing pieces. Find Damie Dawson not guilty.